All right, so yeah, thank you so much. I'm Ian Miller with Washington Sea Grant, coastal bluff erosion at Kalaloch Olympic National Park. Kalaloch referred to here is a little bit north of where Heather just presented on, and I'm pleased to co-present here with Stephen Fratkin from Olympic National Park, and part of this project was also supported by the Cascadia Copes Hub, which is an NSF-funded Cascadia-wide coastal hazards research project. Next slide, please. Oh, look at that. Let's work through all that to the map. Okay, so just to orient, I'm going to spend a few slides orienting both to the geography and to a few things that we think are relevant to the story of bluff erosion at Kalaloch. So first of all, Kalaloch is on the southern end of the coastal strip in Olympic National Park. Next slide, please. And I'm going to use these aerial obliques to try to sort of geographically orient everyone to the site. So these are taken from offshore looking onshore, and I've marked with an arrow there Kalaloch Lodge, which is probably the sort of the most preeminent feature along here that people may be familiar with if you've driven on Highway 101, which also sort of cuts through the site. Kalaloch Lodge is also associated with a bunch of cabins that are available to rent. Together, those are managed by Delaware North as a concession to the national park and are significant in regards to revenue generated, visitation. This is an important site within Olympic National Park. And then to the north is the campground, which is managed by the National Park Service just out of the frame of view of this photograph here. The site that Heather was just talking about is just out of the field of view to the right of this photograph. A few other distinctive things. There's a beautiful broad sandy beach here. The razor clam question alludes to that habitat. And there is some beach access to that beach. This is, again, a very heavily used, important site. And then I just wanted to mark Kalaloch Creek and draw your attention to it in this photograph because it's also potentially important to the story that I'm going to tell. Next slide. But the thing that brings us together here today is the Kalaloch Bluffs, which I've marked in this white line. So the sandy shore here is backed by bluffs of maybe 20 to 40 foot elevation along here, both underlying the cabins and also the campground out of the frame of view to the north of what you see here in the photograph. Next slide, please. So the bluffs along here are complex from a sediment standpoint, from a hydrology standpoint. They're composed of strata layers that are associated with glaciation advances dating back probably a couple 100,000 years here, and also are interbedded with peats that are associated with interglacial periods. So they have this complex stratigraphy, different types of sediment, different properties within the bluffs, and then they also have complex hydrology, which is maybe revealed a little bit by what are icicles that you see on this bluff. This is a photograph that Steve took just a month ago or so during our cold snap. And really the key takeaway here is just to note that these are not, rock cliffs, right? These are erodible piles of sediment, basically. Next slide. Another thing of note on this stretch of shoreline that may be relevant to this story, but is notable when you visit this section of shoreline is large wood. Which you can see in the lower right of this photograph. This is taken from atop the bluff in the campground looking down at the beach. And that wood is obviously plentiful. This is oftentimes something that people, note when you visit the shoreline, not only here at Kalaloch, but at other parts of the Olympic coast as well. But one thing we're also gaining an appreciation of in the next slide is just how variable this large wood can be. This particular photograph was taken just a few days after that previous one, and we can see all that large wood has been stripped off. And so what this means for coastal processes in the bluffs isn't clear yet, but it's definitely something that may be a part of the story. Next slide, please. So another important thing about this site and the coast, the Olympic coast in general, is that it's exposed to relatively large tidal ranges. Maybe on the order of 10 to 12 feet at this particular site, and also large wave events, especially in the wintertime. And those can combine to create what are called collision events. And basically, those are just time periods when the ocean is directly interacting with the bluff, basically because of high tides, maybe storm surge, wave run up, water's actually interacting with the base of the bluffs. And that can both impact the bluffs directly or do things like move large wood around, which can also lead to impacts on the bluffs, kind of as suggested by this photo here. Next slide, please. And then another thing about this site that may be relevant to the story, again, I'm sort of throwing factors out here, and as you'll see, we don't have a great sense for what's important. But this particular part of the coast is also probably slowly subsiding. So on the left there, that map, the more colorful one, ignore the one in blue for the moment, is estimates of vertical land movement, with uplift being hot colors, subsidence being cool colors. And you'll note that Kalaloch sits in a zone that the estimates suggest is maybe slowly subsiding. And coupled with slow rates of sea level rise that are occurring in Washington, what this means is that this area is probably exposed to a slow rate of relative sea level rise. Again, how that fits into the story isn't clear, but could be important. Next slide, please. So, and go ahead and hit it again because there's a photograph there. I don't know where these animations came from, but I'm rolling with it. So starting in 2013, I started going out and implementing sort of a monitoring program at a few sites in Olympic National Park, notably here in Rialto, that are configured very similar to what Heather described, sets of cross-shore transects oriented at the sites that get reoccupied using RTKD GPS equipment, which allows us to do a topography survey and collect locations and elevations with fairly high accuracy, less than a few centimeters. Also along these transects, in some cases collecting counts of wood, things like oblique photos, and sometimes grain size photos, again, oriented towards just developing a long-term understanding of shoreline behavior at these sites. And then that RTKD GPS data also allows you to couple it directly with aerial lidar data if it's available. And next slide. What that sort of data allows us to do is assemble profiles, what are called elevation profiles. That's what you're seeing at the top here, along these transects. These are basically cross sections of the shoreline. The beach at the bottom, you can see the bluff face there and the top of the bluff. And in this case, colors relate to time, with cooler colors being farther back in time. Those are derived from aerial lidar, and hotter colors being more recent survey data. I'm now collecting these roughly every 2 months or so at this site, although in the past it's been sort of somewhat less frequent. But this allows you to do things like assess morphology. You'll note this kind of change in morphology between the older bluff, the sort of 2011 bluff, and the more recent, sort of relatively more vertical bluff face, and also assess the position on the transect of a particular elevation profile. So you can extract a position of, say, the 8-meter elevation contour, which here is kind of right in the middle of the bluff face, track that through time, which is what I've got in the lower right, and allows you to fit a trend and estimate things like average rates of change of the bluff face. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So doing that across a subset of the transects that I showed you previously, this is what we see for sort of an average rate of change of the bluff face between 2011 to 2023. The green here, all within this kind of 0 to 6 inches per year average rate range. And again, this is, you sort of see the creek there as a landmark. So we've got the campground and then south of the lodge. Oh my word, 2 minutes. And then if we hit the next slide, zooming into the lodge, next slide, we see quite a different pattern. So here I've colored according to sort of rates, with red being over a foot of year. Our maximum rate is found closer to the creek, 3.5 feet per year of average erosion over this time period. But then also this spatial gradient from the creek moving south of reduced average rates until we hit that sort of green, sort of 0 to 6 inches per year zone that was associated with both up toward the campground and farther south from here. So go ahead and hit the next slide. A few things that are notable about this. One is George Kaminsky and Diana McCandless from the ecology team did an aerial photo-based analysis that they published in 2002, found a very similar spatial gradient, high rates of erosion closer to the creek, lower rates as you move south from the creek, but much lower rates based on this analysis and over this time period. So that's led us to conclude that we may be looking at an acceleration in the rate of erosion, especially nearer to the creek. Next slide. These results led them to conclude that that erosion is likely due to creek processes, that sort of more rapid erosion nearer to the creek. But the relatively low rates that they observed led them to suggest that it may be possible to implement measures to either slow or stabilize that retreat. And here we find those much more rapid rates, which may call that sort of conclusion into question. And perhaps as a result, next slide, some of these cabins are now slated for removal. They're tagged as you see here. I believe that 2 cabins currently have this tag. I'm not sure what the plans are for others, but next slide. And this kind of decision making, sort of ideally benefits from higher frequency information coming in about the state of the bluffs. So as a consequence, starting in October, we installed 5 Chronolog stations, and go ahead and hit the next slide just to reveal the other photographs. These are just posts with a camera sort of mount at the top of them, and then an email that invites a user to take a picture and submit it to a system via email. Next slide. There are 5, oh, hit the next slide. I don't know where these animations came from. There's 5 of these currently at Kalaloch. Been there since the fall. We've had about 120 photos submitted by 90 users, so reasonably good engagement, heavily visited site. These are available online. The photos and the time lapses that are generated from them. Go ahead and hit the next slide. And this is what some of the views look like. This is one of the Chronolog stations looking up towards the creek from the south. And this is the initial photo that was added to the database. And then this is, go ahead and hit the next slide. And then this is one taken at the end of January. And hopefully you can make out sort of the significant erosion that you can see here in the field of view. And again, the idea is to use this higher frequency information, not only to learn about sort of rates and patterns of bluff erosion, but also to inform, when to close particular cabins that may be unsafe during particular time periods. Next slide. So ending just with what does the future hold? This is some work by Meredith Luong at Oregon State University, funded by the Cascadia COPES Hub, that basically looked at sort of integrated climate change models to model what we call total water level. This is sort of the maximum elevation that water reaches because of all processes combined. Focus on the orange box, which is the collision hours. This is the amount of time that you expect along a particular reach that water's actually interacting with something like a bluff or a dune. And not surprisingly, because of climate-driven processes, we expect that amount of time to go up, which suggests, of course, that these rates and patterns of erosion, these accelerations observed at Kalaloch, are likely to sort of be part of our future moving ahead. Next slide. So thank you. A couple conclusions, contact information as well. And I'll let you read those and see if there's any time for questions or discussion.
Way to pull it home, Ian. Fascinating stuff. Absolutely fascinating stuff. What am I going to say to that? Thank you very much. Really appreciate your efforts here. And we actually are a little bit over time. I don't see any questions in the chat. If somebody has a quick question, we can probably entertain that. But otherwise, maybe, Hannah Drummond, let's hear.
Yeah, I can be quick. Thanks, Ian. Just one thing to point out. So we did do an update to that 2002 study, and we got a erosion rate of 1.04 meters per year. So that's really close to that 3.5 feet that you had, which is cool to see. And then my follow-up there is, do you have any kind of sense of the erosion rates kind of more in the bend of that river, a little bit landward of where your transects were laid out?
Not from my data. Steve, I think, more recently has collected some observations from more inside that curve.
Yeah, we have some measurements that we put in. We put in some land-based measurement systems, some flagging manually taking bluff measurements to the bluff edge in response to some of the management concerns that we have with regards to those cabins. And we have, over the last since November, we've seen over 4 meters of bluff erosion in some of those areas. And remarkably, you know, I think Ian showed this, and I think you may have mentioned it, Ian, is that, you know, historically the toe of those slopes have sort of gone out a fair amount, and now most of those bluff edges are vertical, and you also saw that in Ian's data. And so now those bluffs are really eroding quickly. Okay. We're happy to talk with you guys more offline about this.